All right, as we begin our study of the skeleton, first we want to recognize the overall organization of the skeleton. We have what's called an axial skeleton, having to do with the axis of the body, and then we have the appendicular skeleton that has to do with the appendages and supporting the appendages. In the axial skeleton of the human skeleton, we have the skull, vertebrae, ribs, and sternum. Those are the components that are considered part of that axial structure, the main trunk of the body. And then those things having to do with the limbs, primarily the appendicular skeleton. We have a pectoral girdle having to do with the shoulder girdle, and forelimbs, or arms in the human case. And then pelvic girdle, the hip bones primarily, and then the hind limbs or legs for humans. So that's the overview of the components of the skeleton. Now we're going to deal specifically first with the skull. In our discussion of the skull, the anatomy of the skull is going to center around these three groups of bones. Bones that are derived from the embryonic neurocranium, where it essentially forms a support beneath the brain, underneath of the brain as the brain begins to form. A series of skeletal elements, first cartilage, starts out as hyaline cartilage, underneath of the brain, developing in there, supporting it from beneath. It's kind of like a chassis in a car that supports the rest of the car above it. But anyway, our neurocranium, cartilage bone that supports the brain from below. So that's one part of our skull, and we'll see that in the different groups. Dermatocranium, the next group, this is all dermal bone, starts as intramembranous bone, and in cases, most of the human skull above, and the lower jaw as well on the outside of the lower jaw. But anyway, we'll look at all the parts of the dermatocranium here as we go through. But this does not show up in the phylogenetic chart until we get to the bony fishes. The lamprey, hagfish, and cartilaginous fishes do not have this dermatocranium portion to their skeleton. So that's something that pops up when you get to the bony fish, like Polypterus, the gar, those fish in there. Their skull, we saw the amia, the bowfin fish also has this well-structured dermatocranium in there. The last group of bones, the splanchnocrinium, starts out as supports for gill arches, and the lamprey and the sharks, we see that there's quite a isolated and well-structured splanchnocrinium separate from the neurocranium in there and the other bones of the skull. So this splanchnocrinium is associated with gill arches and jaws. The jaws and gill arches are splanchnocrinium in there. Another name for this is the visceral skeleton. Again, when you think of viscera, you think internal organs, and since this surrounds the pharynx region, around the mouth and pharynx, it's the beginning of the gut, so it's the start of what we think of as visceral organs, and it's called the visceral skeleton sometimes, that splanchnocrinium component. So we'll look at things that are first neurocranium, then dermatocranium, and then splanchnocrinium in their developmental origin in the skull. Okay, here we have the embryonic neurocranium. In several species of fish and amphibians, they've looked at the embryonic stages of development to see where the early cartilaginous structures come from that support the brain from below to form this embryonic brain case. And the components I've put in different colors here, and we're going to label the different components back here. The notochord, let's see, let's put, here's the notochord right here. The notochord would come right up to the back end of this structure and make contact with that structure right in the very posterior side. So This is all brain right here, and then your spinal cord starts, and underneath of that you're going to find your notochord in there. So that notochord comes up and makes contact with the back of your brain case. The first thing to identify here, to either side of where the notochord ends right here, these are called paracortals. Or more properly, paracortal cartilages. Para just means next to, so they're kind of right next to where the notochord ends, and these are referred to as precortal. Cartilages on either side in the front. So that makes up the main linear support left and right beneath the brain. In the very front, they're joined together here with what's called an ethmoid plate. The ethmoid plate in the front. And in the back right here is what we call a basal plate. So ethmoidal plate in the front, basal plate in the back. In addition to those 6 cartilages, there are 2 up here in the front and 2 in the back that are associated with our special senses. The 2 in the front have to do with olfactory senses, and these are referred to as olfactory capsules. And those in the back, here in red, these are referred to as otic capsules. Otic has to do with the inner ear structure. Semicircular canals will form inside that structure, and other inner ear components are derived from the otic capsule in here. So this is where we start when we're forming a neurocranium. Paracortals, precortals, ethmoid plate, basal plate, 2 olfactory capsules, 2 otic capsules. These fuse and early on become unrecognizable as individual parts in most species, and in humans they never really take on this shape. This is kind of what you would see in, like I said, some fish and amphibians would have basically these components in the early developmental stages. But that's kind of a starting point when we're thinking about the structure of the embryonic neurocranium. All right, in the formation of the human neurocranium, we can identify these features early on in development, places where cartilage will turn into bone. So these are different ossification centers, or where we're going to see bone develop in here. Starting in the front up here, this is the ethmoid. The ethmoid bone will form from that, and so we refer to that as the ethmoid center of ossification. The ethmoid, next in red here. We have the sphenoidal centers of ossification. So this forms part of the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone. There will be more to the sphenoid bone than just this neurocranial component, we'll see. Finally, not finally, but next, this part in green here is referred to as the otic, O-T-I-C, center of ossification. It becomes part of the temporal bone. The temporal bone, otic capsule there. Other bone will be added to the temporal bone, so the temporal bone will be made of more than one kind of bone. But anyway, that's the otic center. And finally, the one in the back here from the basal plate, this is known as the occipital center of ossification. So we have these 4 centers of ossification that come together in the floor of the skull to form the neurocranium. Now, when talking about the dermatocranium, there are a number of bones of the skull that are dermatocranial in origin. It's a little difficult to learn them sometimes, so we're going to kind of break them down into subgroups. And so let's list the subgroups of dermatocranial bone First of all, there's what we call a roofing series. It starts in your nasal and lacrimal bones up here in the front and goes across the top of your head to the back of your head. So we call those all roofing bones. Roofing bones. The first dermatocranial bone group, sometimes you just call them dermal bone groups in the skull. So next in here is what we call the primary palatal series. We use the term series sometimes, a roofing series, primary palatal series, or groups. So anyway, that primary palate, we'll explain this later. Your palate, the roof of your mouth, is not this palate. Between your nasal passages and the floor of your brain is what we call the primary palate. That's between your nasal passages and your oral cavity in there. That's your secondary palate. So we're talking about the primary palate here. This would lie adjacent to the neurocranium on the floor of the skull. Next, the upper jaw bones. For humans, this is only the maxilla. For other animals, there are other bones involved. And then the lower jaw. And again, for humans, there's only one, the mandible or dentary bone. In other vertebrates, there would be several lower jaw bones in there. But anyway, these are all derived from dermal bone. So let's look at some examples in the human skeleton of these right here. Okay, this is an illustration from the website of the roofing bones of the skull, part of the dermatocranium. The primary ones, as you go across the top, we usually think of nasal, then the frontal bone here, parietal bone here, and then occipital bone, just part of it, not all of it, because part of the occipital is part of your neurocranium. So this is neurocranial down there. So this is dermatocranium, this, and this. And then along the side, we have the lacrimal, we have the zygomatic bone or cheekbone in there, and then this portion, just part of the temporal bone, the temporal squama, or the flat part on the side of the head. So those are the roofing bones of dermatocranium. Okay, in this image, I'm sorry, it's a little excessively bright, but this is looking at the skull from underneath. This would be the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord comes from, the base of the brain stem comes through from the floor of the brain. This is the back of the skull, the lower jaw, you can see the rim right across there. So we're looking up at the floor of the skull from beneath, and this is the back edge of your hard palate right here. So the bones that are involved in the palatal group, this is the dermal bone group, dermatocranial bones of the primary palatal series. So we've got the palatine bone across here. We've got part of the sphenoid here. These are called the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid bone that are derived from dermal bone. And then finally the vomer back in here. So those three bones, part of the sphenoid, the pterygoid process, the palatine bones, and the vomer, dermal bones of the palatal group. Okay, the last two dermal bone groups are going to be seen in this picture. We only have one maxilla in the human and one mandible. So there's a reduction in bones in humans, so we only have one of each. So the upper jaw series is represented by the maxilla. The lower jaw group is represented by the mandible bone. Okay, now we'll look at the splanchno cranium. Remember, that's also known as a visceral skeleton. It goes around the pharynx. So these elements are found right along here in our pharyngeal arches. The first visceral arch in there includes both the upper and lower jaw. The upper jaw component of the first arch right here is known as the palatal quadrate. Too long a word, but anyway, palatal quadrate, that's one element of the first arch. And then the second one makes up part of the lower jaw component in there, and it's known as Meckel's cartilage, M-E-C-K-E-L''S. Meckel's cartilage, I'll abbreviate cartilage. Palatal quadrate and Meckel's cartilage. First arch component, so those together are first arch. Also known as the mandibular arch. First arch is mandibular arch. It includes the palatal quadrate and Meckel's cartilage. Next, in green there, we have the second arch. That's also known as the hyoid arch. Second arch is hyoid arch. Then behind that, third arch, and then finally the fourth arch. So we're going to be concerned with the adult derivatives of these embryonic structures in here. Palatal quadrate component, Meckel's cartilage, second arch or hyoid arch, third arch, and then fourth arch. Elements that contribute to the human structure. Okay, now we're going to try to identify the parts of the human skull that are derived from those visceral skeleton elements. First of all, from the palatal quadrate, first part of the first arch, the upper jaw portion of the first arch, of the splachnocranium, we have two things. Part of your sphenoid bone, we've identified sphenoid components from dermatocranium and also in the neurocranium. So this is a third part. This is known as the atlas sphenoid. It's found right on the side of the skull behind the lateral part of your zygomatic out there and in front of your temporal bone, the atlas sphenoid bone. One of your small middle ear bones, known as the incus, and we're going to talk about the derivation of the incus a little later on, but that's also derived from that original palatal quadrate, the first component of the upper jaw. The middle ear bone known as the malleus. It may have two L's in it, I'm not sure, but anyway, malleus is in there. Embryonically, there was a large component of the lower jaw, that malleus, that first cartilage. In a shark, the entire lower jaw is cartilage, and it's Meckel's cartilage derived from that first arch component. And the amount of cartilage in that lower jaw is quickly reduced in human development and becomes replaced by dermal bone. That becomes all dermal bone there. So the malleus is your component from the Meckel's cartilage. Next, from the second arch, the stapes, also known as the stirrup, the third of your middle ear bones right in there. Stapes derived from that, as is your styloid process off of your temporal bone, styloid process. And a portion of your hyoid bone. So part of the hyoid bone is derived from the second arch. From the third arch, the remainder of your hyoid out there. So this is also hyoid part. So that's part of your third arch. So this is arch 3. Anything in green here was from arch 2, the hyoid arch. In red is the lower jaw portion of arch number 1. And in brown, the upper jaw portion of arch number 1, the quadrate part. So the quadrate part of arch number 1, Alice Phenoidenicus, the lower jaw component of arch number 1, the Meckel's cartilage component, the malleus. From arch number 2, we have the stapes, the styloid process, and part of your hyoid bone. And then from the third arch, we have also the remainder of your hyoid bone. What about arch number 4 and 5 that are in there? They become part of your laryngeal cartilage as part of the larynx, not actually part of the skeleton per se, but support for your larynx.